Labroka Shavalovich.
Say it one more time.
Labroka.
Добро пожаловать назад.
Добро.
Добро
Добро.
пожаловать.
Babalogit.
Пожаловать.
Babalogit. Babrok.
Добро
Dobrok.
по
Po.
жа
Ja.
ло
Lo.
бать.
Vite.
Бать. Пожаловать.
Bajalovich. Yes! Welcome back to Wetaskiwin-Composite High School, where we are going to have a midterm next week so that I can sit at my desk and do nothing. And my students can write stuff that I'm not actually going to read. I'm just going to give you a mark based upon previous work, because that's what teachers do. And the sources we're going to be looking at, we'll be looking at the evolution of the Soviet Union and as it becomes the Russian Federation, and that nation's impact on global affairs. And first, in order to explain this relationship, this story, we have to look at the end of the USSR. So the story today begins at the end of the USSR. I remember August 1991 because obviously I was in Saudi Arabia with Operation Desert Shield. Google it if you don't believe that that's a thing. And I remember that there was a coup in August of 1991 in the USSR. And it was a hardline coup. And I'm going to go out on an edge here and assume my classmates here have no idea what a hardline coup is. Anybody know what a hardline coup is? Nobody knows what a hardline coup is. So a coup is an attempt at an undemocratic change in government. So a coup isn't an election. A coup is usually a military uprising to change the government, to change the head of state. And it's a hardline coup, meaning that those trying to change the state, they're trying to go away from the reformer that is Gorbachev, away from glasnost and perestroika, and back to a hardliner like, I have a very bright class, hardliner like Stalin. They do like to whisper stuff. So this is an attempt at re-Stalinization. So Khrushchev de-Stalinized. The hardline coup in August of '91 was attempting to re-Stalinize, to go back to a totalitarian state, and it failed. And it failed because of Boris Yeltsin. Oh, good old Boris Yeltsin. See, what Boris Yeltsin did in Moscow is he went and he spoke to the tank commanders, and he challenged them to join him on the right side of history. He said that history was watching and that they could either side with the hardline coup and bring back Stalinist-like USSR, or side with him. And he presented himself as the voice of a Russian nation. And he jumped up on that tank and he spoke to the people inside. It turns out that they listened and they agreed that a coup to go back towards Stalinism was not in the best interest of the people, and therefore the attempt at re-Stalinization failed, and now we have a lame duck Gorbachev put back into power. And I say lame duck because clearly Boris Yeltsin had command over the military, and therefore Russia wanted to, like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia had already began to do, break away from the USSR. And when Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia breaks away from the USSR, that's like PEI breaking away and like, I don't know, not even Nova Scotia, but like that little island off of Nova Scotia. Something Island. PEI is Prince Edward Island. What's that other one? Cape Breton Island. Right, so we lose Cape Breton Island, we lose PEI, and we lose maybe Vancouver Island. Canada doesn't really lose a whole lot, right? So Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia break away. We don't lose a lot. But when Russia says we're going to break away, that's like Ontario leaving Canada. Albertans might celebrate that, but in reality, that is really the death of Canada. So when the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, announces his aspiration to break away from the USSR, that is a de facto announcement that the USSR is going to die. USSR dies Christmas Day, 1991. Source 1 on your test next week will be some observations from Gorbachev from that moment. And in those observations, we're going to see Gorbachev talking about why the USSR died. So you need to know that the USSR died because it couldn't compete with America economically. because of the misallocation of resources towards the Soviet military, to the expense of like 25% of their budget per year, they had bankrupted the nation. They misallocated resources away from consumer items. Not only did they economically bankrupt the nation by overemphasizing guns over butter, but they lost the hearts and minds of the people of Russia. When I went to the Soviet Union in 1989, the people of Russia were in love with the idea of American culture, Western culture. I've talked about this in the past, about how they wanted to barter for our Levi jeans and stuff like that. Their thirst for American culture meant that the United States won the Cold War by winning the war of hearts and minds. That's why Russia falls, because they'd overemphasized guns over butter in this military contest to show which ideology is superior in the Cold War. As a result, they lose the people, because the economy doesn't meet the needs of the people. There's also other reasons, like a lack of political openness. That's why Glasnost was meant to resolve that, but in the end, it wasn't enough. That the USSR had died by trying to compete with the Americans globally in this bipolar world. So that's the first source. You're going to get some quotes from his speech that he gives Christmas of 1991. But there's information that you need to understand before we get to the next part of the story. And the next part of the story that we see on the test is Russia invades Ukraine. That's a big jump. That's a generation right there. So how do we go from this, and I almost put this on the test. I put this on the test in the past. But how do we go from the reality of that, the reality of the USSR breaking away, to a war that is putting the world today, I believe, at the brink of a global World War III? How do we go from that to this? That's one of the outcomes I'd like you to figure out here today. Having said that, when we see the USSR ship sink, this is like question 60 on the final exam. This is like one of the last multiple choice, or maybe the last multiple choice question you'll get on part B. What type of national transition are we seeing? We're seeing the death of ideological nationalism here and the rebirth of ethnic nationalism. Each one of those SSRs going off in their own direction, those are ethnic nations. Ukraine is an ethnic nation. The USSR was an ideological socioeconomic experiment. So this cartoon shows the people were not ready for a socioeconomic utopia, that they still, in their hearts, were defined by their blood. So we do have that. But let's talk more about what happens after the USSR boat sinks and these SSRs go in their own direction. I remember watching the Soviet Union with great interest in 1991, and then Russia with great interest in 1992. Because I had traveled there recently, I was very motivated to see what happened, and it wasn't necessarily what I anticipated. The empire nearly struck back. 1992, 1993, 1994, these were hard years for the Soviet people. These were hard years for Russia, for Ukraine, for the SSRs. Because what had been taken away was the security of centrally planned economics. With centrally planned economics comes wage and price controls. So when you go down to the store, bread had a set price. Vodka had a set price. Everybody could afford the essentials of good life, bread and vodka. But once the market was free of government centralization, of government answering the three basic economic questions, what's produced, how to produce, and how to allocate it, who to allocate it to, once that the market was free to fluctuate in terms of prices, a lot of those things people used to be able to afford became a lot more expensive. Therefore, in the initial years of Russia, the quality of life, the standard of living went down. So in 1992 and 1993 and 1994, there's a growing sentiment, you know what, let's bring the USSR back. And I mention that because Putin today wants to bring the USSR back. Now, I'm not saying he wants to bring the USSR back because he wants to return to centrally planned economics and he wants to bring back a higher quality life, standard of living, but he has that same emotion. He's bringing it back, or attempting to bring it back, because he sees himself in a line of czars, right? Tsar Nicholas II, Tsar Alexander III, all those czars of the Romanov family, And you judge those czars by how much territorial expansion they're able to create for Mother Russia. Russia is the biggest country in the world. It's not even close. It's almost the size of Canada and the United States combined. It becomes that big by military expansionism. And you judge Catherine the Great and Ivan the Terrible and all these people, Peter the Great, by how much Russia they were able to add to Russia. And Putin is not a young guy. I think he's like 71. His legacy will be defined in these final years. He wants to add territory so that he can be seen as, Putin the Great. But before we can get to Putin, we need to finish up the story of Boris Yeltsin. So Boris Yeltsin becomes the first president of Russia. Boris Yeltsin, I fear, is one of the biggest disappointments in history. He comes in with a lot of promise. He's that guy that stood on the tank. He's the guy that was pivotal to bring down that August coup. But history remembers him as a dysfunctional alcoholic that took the Soviet economy that at times had began to challenge the American one and had sold it off for parts. When you privatize the economy, so you take all these state-owned companies, state-owned oil, natural gas companies, when you privatize them, you have to sell them to individuals. He sold them to his friends for pennies on the dollar. So what he ended up doing was similar to like American gangster practices in the 30s. There was a family, a central compact around him. They got very powerful. These are the Russian oligarchs. They got very powerful because they were able to purchase these formerly state-owned companies for only pennies of what they're worth. So they get powerful. He does a lot of drinking. The Russian people do a lot of suffering. There is a desire to go back. And at the same time, now that ethnic nationalism is reawoken, in parts of Russia, Russian people are a minority. So in places like Chechnya, even in places like Siberia, the people, the locals, the indigenous peoples of the areas, if you will, to use a Canadian term, they're saying, well, maybe we should break away from Russia. So Yeltsin finds his country in a sense of turmoil, and some of these sources show some of the consequences of that. These are the ones showing the expense of competing with the United States in that military race. This is one talking about the fact that the USSR had achieved some great stuff. I get that nostalgia around the USSR with Yuri Gagarin. I know I mispronounced it, but that's pretty darn close. Being first in space, and Sputnik being first satellite in space, and Yada being first dog in space. Maybe, is that the dog's name, Yada? Or is that the car? Maybe they named the car after the dog. Yeah, I don't know. But, we've got this idea of we need to go back. And we can see that with the real GDP of Russia falling. The Russian economy shrinks in these first years. So when the people of Russia finally get capitalism, it sucks. Consumer price inflation index over 1,000%. Prices aren't going up a little bit, they're going up a lot. We're dealing with inflation in Canada right now around 7%, and I'm freaking out about it. Carrots are $4 a pound. Oh, woe is me. 1,000% inflation, I'd probably be, well, I'm not going to say it on YouTube, but I'd be violent. We'll just leave it at that. That's my threat to, I can't say who I'm threatening. So here we go. Communism was waiting 2 hours to buy bread. Capitalism is waiting 2 years to be able to afford it. This is that nostalgia around the security that left-wing economics provided. We didn't have everything we wanted. We didn't have all the, the cereals that they have in America, but at least we had guaranteed access to the essentials. And now with a free market, not everybody could afford it. And here's some actual numbers of price changes. So you can see how quickly things explode. Bread, 605 up to 3146. Again, you don't have to memorize numbers like that. And then what did this mean? Well, the approval of the change to democracy. So at the birth of these new democratic states, the USSR becomes, the various SSRs become nations. But in '89, the Eastern Bloc, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, these nations end up getting their independence from the Soviet sphere of influence. In '91, they are like, we like liberalism. But by '09, not so much. And I really don't want to offend my Ukrainian friends, because I feel like I'm completely ignorant of your guys' reality, right? But looking at this number here, I think Putin screwed up. In 2009, only 30% of people in Ukraine approved of democracy. There was an opportunity to ally with Ukraine, because Ukrainian people were struggling with liberty, with democracy and capitalism, right? You can see the numbers of capitalism. Only 36% of the people were saying capitalism's working. But instead of embracing them in terms of hearts and minds and having that shared struggle, they just roll in tanks. That's not the right thing to do. So there was a frustration in Ukraine against embracing the Western vision of the world that Russian authoritarians and people like Putin could have supported. I don't want to use played off of, because it sounds manipulative, but politicians would do that. But instead of doing that, they invaded. Even if you look at recent polls from 10 years ago, there was a lot more pro-Russian sentiment in Ukraine than obviously you're going to see today. That's because Putin messed up. Putin messed up. So we have all these other cartoons. Some of them are out of sequence. This cartoon is suggesting that Uncle Sam, the United States, is looking at communism self-destructing, but the reality is, have you looked at America? Have you looked at Canada? We have hundreds of homeless people in Wetaskiwin. We have thousands in Edmonton. We have drug use on the streets. We're not thriving. We're not thriving. The North Korean propaganda videos that used to make fun of North America, but have to manipulate that, have to fabricate it, they've become true. That we are a failed system too. So we have some opportunity for you to explore ideologically what system is working best. But we also have these numbers that show to what extent would you rather go back to the USSR? To what extent was Stalin a wise leader? And you can see that, as the years progressed, there's this idea that, going back to Stalin might not be a bad idea. Because liberalism's not working, let's go back to Stalin. And Putin is playing on that. So again, how do we get to Putin? I guess I need to fill that story in. Yeltsin was the alcoholic. He's that gangster for hire that made his friends rich, the oligarchs. By 2009, he has served his constitutionally limited 2 terms in office. And he's also a little sick, and he's made his money. So he passes his torch over to his vice president, Putin. And Putin wasn't much of a politician at this time. He had had some following in Leningrad. He had had a moderate career with the KGB earlier, but he wasn't a national hero. He wasn't really a star rising within Russia. But Boris Yeltsin passed him the torch because he thought, Putin's a guy that's not going to come after me for all the crimes that I've done. He's going to let me get away with basically robbing the country. Once Putin's in power, Putin successfully deals with breakaway attempts in Chechnya. So he shuts that down. And by shutting that down, by actually resolving an issue that drunken Yeltsin couldn't, people rally around him. He also comes to power at a time when there's much unrest in the Middle East. There's war again in Iraq and stuff like that. So because there's unrest in the Middle East, oil and natural gas prices go up in the world. And Europe needs to find a non-Middle Eastern source of oil and natural gas. So Russia's economy thrives under Putin early because they can export oil and natural gas. And often with his economic foreign policy, there's political ties. We will sell you oil and natural gas for a little less than we could, but we want you to be more loyal to Moscow than Washington. That's a big part of Putin's foreign policy in the 21st century. And there were some countries, allies of the America, that were becoming addicted to Russian oil and natural gas, including Germany. And that's what made the invasion of Ukraine difficult, is because nations like Germany had to first pivot away from Russian imports and then stand up to Russia. So what I'm suggesting to you is on the video, here's that nostalgia. In the Soviet Union, right before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, more than half the people would rather go back to the in Russia, go back to the Soviet Union era. So there is a lot of support for that happening. So we're going to see that in the set, but we're also going to need to look at how did the Soviets see the Americans. So the Soviets, even during détente, they presented the Americans as the global threat. So if you look at propaganda cartoon pictures from the USSR from the 1970s, and that's going to be the second source, you're going to see America going around the world and using their military so that they can get rich. It's basically neo-colonial imperialism, right? The United States isn't going to plant their flag in Argentina or Chile, but they're going to use their military to take control of those countries. They're going to use the CIA to take control of those countries. They're going to control them so that American corporations can get rich. To do well on the second source, you're going to want to look into that narrative. The idea that during the Cold War, the United States military went to places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, even went to Central and South American places like Nicaragua, Honduras, Chile, Argentina, and manipulated the regimes there so that American companies could come in and get rich. That's going to be the essence, the argument of the second source. Second source is trying to say the United States is going around the world robbing people. And then the third source, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the Russians are coming in to rob people. So there's this overarching story of Gorbachev saying the Soviets competed with the United States, and that led to our downfall because we had an ideology that had basically poisoned our system, put us into this global competition that we shouldn't have been in. And now you have, in the third source, Putin wanting to go back into that competition. And in the third source, you have the Russians being the global aggressor. And in the second source, you have NATO being the aggressor. So another aspect of the set is, who's the bad guy? Is it NATO? Is it Russia? And should we be embracing nationalism, or should we be working through NATO and embracing internationalism? How can we defend what is ours? Those are some things that you'll want to consider before Monday. So I wanted to give you a bit of the end of the USSR story that includes the August of 91 coup, that includes a reference in passing to Gorbachev's Christmas speech that you should look up, but also shows the difficulty that the Russian people have in 1992, 93, 94 with deregulation and privatization. I needed to fill in the gap by telling you that Yeltsin gets rich, and so do his friends. But Putin becomes the leader in 99 because Yeltsin could only be in office for 2 terms. Once Putin's in office, he's going to override the Constitution. He should have been gone years ago, but he has ignored the Constitution, and he's now going to be there at least until 2030, unless somebody kills him first. That's how they got rid of Stalin, right? The CIA poisoned him, so maybe they can get to him. But he is probably the most protected person in the world. So good luck. Then we need to look at, Russia's relationship with Ukraine and what Russia's trying to accomplish by invading Ukraine. And I don't know how much we know of Ukraine. Maybe it's the breadbasket of Europe. But it's not only just rich because it's a bread basket, but there's minerals that the Russian economy needs. Now, Russia's the biggest country in the world. They have lots of minerals, but they're only trying to get wealthier, right? And they're only trying to gain that territory for the glory of Putin. So there's lots of elements of nationalism to unpack in those sources. I think you have an opportunity to do well next week, but you do have some work that you might want to go back and look at as well. Any questions before I hit end? So how do I say, like, goodbye, or see you later, or this is it, this is the end in Russian? I think I used to know how to say goodbye in Russian.
Just goodbye. Пока.
Пока?
Yeah. Or
You could be telling me to swear right now, and I wouldn't know.
how would I do that?
It'd be funny. Пока, right?
Yeah.
I did that so well. Пока.